Hello, English 122. This is your teacher, Guillaume. We are in the middle of week 13. Week 14 is about to begin. You are writing your argument papers. And I thought it might be helpful if we took a look at 3 new argument papers together. I will go through them and I will tell you what I think. What we'll do, let me share my screen. We'll be looking for whether we can find the basic argument features in these 3 different sample arguments. So we're looking for an arguable position. Do they have background information? Are they providing good reasons for their claim? Good evidence that helps explain those reasons. We're going to look for their usage of persuasive appeals. So that's pathos, logos, ethos. And within logos, we'll see if there's anything about the way they use logic that stands out. Are there any logical fallacies or really good examples of logic usage? What kind of maybe reasoning, deductive or inductive that they may be using? We'll see how they deal with other positions if they do so at all. In total, we'll look at 3 different arguments. One of them is a professional writer from the New York Times, and then we've got a couple of former students who did pretty well on their papers that I'd like to talk about. So I want to show you, I am sharing the screen, yes I am. This is where our first argument that we're going to analyze comes from. It's called Let's Launch a Moonshot for Meatless Meat. You can find it here at the New York Times. I think you might get some, they may allow you to look at a few free articles if you don't have a subscription. Sometimes people wonder, why do I look at the New York Times? Well, one, I can't really afford a whole bunch of different subscriptions, so I pick 1 or 2 news subscriptions that I think are most useful. I think the writing style in the New York Times is quite good, and I think they're overall a pretty good paper. I don't believe everything they say. I think they sometimes kind of get on a bandwagon and everyone kind of writes about the same thing. But overall, they're quite good, especially when it comes to writing things like opinions, arguments, and just basic writing style. So that's why I like to take things from the New York Times. So we're going to look at this one called Let's Launch a Moonshot for Meatless Meat. I have already downloaded it, so we're just going to look at the version of it that will be available to you in a couple of days. Here it is. Let's launch a moonshot for meatless meat. All right, so this will just be kind of an informal talk through. You can just listen to my droning voice and consider what I'm saying and whether you agree. Okay. Knowing that this was written professionally for a newspaper, we know by now that there's probably going to be some differences in style. The paragraphs are probably going to be a little shorter than you're used to writing, although they're quite nice. Maybe Ezra, oh, I know Ezra Klein. He's pretty well-known journalist and writer. What was I just saying? Oh, he may not be using a T structure paragraph. Remember those? TEA. Topic statement for your paragraph. E is evidence for the evidence that's in your paragraph that's backing up that topic sentence. And A is for analysis, which is you talking about the evidence and helping us make sense of it. He may not use that T structure in every one of his body paragraphs, but we'll see if he does. Okay. Let's launch a moonshot for meatless meat. Right off the bat, pretty good title. We already have a suggestion that he's asking us to do something or to consider taking some action. A moonshot for meatless meat. So he's making a comparison to the space race. You know, when the United States was competing with the Soviet Union to get into space first, to get on the moon. So he's talking about that, but he's saying rather than going to the moon, let's do the same sort of effort for meatless meat. That seems to be what he's talking about. Okay, let's go. Here's his introduction. Arguments are more formal, so sometimes their introductions can be a little bit more dry than we've been doing with our previous assignments. But at the same time, he's trying to engage and get and make random readers of the New York Times interested. So he still has to kind of drag us in somehow, or not drag us in, but hook us in somehow and interest us. So let's see how he does it. I'm a vegan, but I'm also a realist. There's no chance humanity is going to give up meat en masse anytime soon. That said, we can't just wish away the risks of industrial animal agriculture. If we don't end this system soon, terrible things will happen to us and to the planet. Terrible things are already happening. Let's consider this introduction. I like this really punchy opening phrase. I'm a vegan, but I'm also a realist. So we have a kind of a scary word for a lot of people, not for me necessarily, and maybe not for you, but a lot of people, they think, uh-oh, a vegan. I'm not sure if I want to read this, but right off the bat, he follows that up with, but I'm also a realist. So we have a sense of a person who probably has a very strong bias towards convincing people to stop eating or mistreating animals. But on the other hand, he's letting us know right away before we tune out that he understands that this is probably that he has realistic concerns regarding this, and probably understands that he can't change everyone's mind. Okay, and he continues to talk about how, yeah, he realizes we're not going to give up meat, but there are still problems. I'm sorry, let me get my comment form out. Here we have, there are still problems. There's the risk of industrial animal agriculture. And he lets us know that some terrible things, that was useless, never mind about that. He's letting us know that if we don't do anything about it, something bad may happen. In fact, things are happening that are already bad. Pretty nice introduction. We haven't yet gotten to his thesis, right? We don't really know what he's arguing, something to do with eating less meat, but we don't know what his exact proposal is. So this is going to be a column about finding a way to work with humanity's growing appetite for meal rather than against it. All we want to do is replace the animals, or at least a lot of them. Technologically, we're closer to that than you may think. What we need, I think this might be the thesis, what we need is for the government to put money and muscle behind the project, just as it's doing for electric cars and weatherized homes and renewable energy, so that the future happens fast enough to save the present. This is the hole in the American jobs plan, and it wouldn't take much money, just a bit of vision to fill. So backing up, we see he wants us to replace most of the animals that we eat with something that isn't an animal product. He says he's actually directing his claim at the group of people he thinks have the power to do something, which is the government, to put money and muscle behind the project. So it's going to cost some money, but he tells us not a lot of money, but mostly effort, kind of like what it took to get us on the moon. I like this nested phrase here where he uses the M dash and then another M dash, and in the middle he just kind of stuck extra information that's really irrelevant. He's comparing his claims to what we did with electric cars and weatherized homes. Yeah, he's reminding us of the significance of his claim, which is we have to save ourselves. And he also, in his thesis, manages to tie all of this to the American jobs plan. So he even gets people who are more easily persuaded through economic or labor arguments. He's even getting them to be interested, all in his thesis. Pretty remarkable. This is, okay, good. So let's keep going. If he is in fact organizing his writing well, he should help us understand what steps are going to be followed in this essay. Like, what are the next pieces? And the best way to do that is to use a topic statement for your body paragraphs. That's the T in TEA, in T paragraphs. So let's see if he does that. Let me first lay out the urgency of the task and the rewards we could reap. Hey, that's a topic statement. I mean, assuming that the rest of the paragraph, or even the rest of this section here, is in fact about what benefits and rewards we could get. Let's see if it is. I'm going to kind of read a little faster, kind of skim through. At best, we can tell. So he's talking about the coronavirus and how it started. There's nothing unusual about that. And now he's talking about swine flu, avian flu, Ebola. Okay, so actually he's talking about diseases. Preventing the next pandemic, a report by the United Nations Environment Program estimates that 75% of the new infectious diseases that threaten humans come from animals. Aha! So that first sentence, it wasn't so much the topic statement for this particular paragraph. It sounds more like a topic statement for a section of paragraphs, like a little group of paragraphs that he's relating together. And this first paragraph is more like the first piece of what he's telling us. That it sounds like he's saying animals and humans mixing together causes pandemics. So that's probably one of the benefits that we could reap. But he hasn't yet said all of that. I'm just kind of assuming. Let's keep going. The UN report, so he's talking about this report here that he is using for his evidence, this United Nations, the Preventing the Next Pandemic report. The UN report goes on, so now we know just from this little transition that we have not left the information provided by that first source. You may want to do that in your writing. This person goes on to say, now hopefully the writer, Ezra Klein, is going to eventually tell us what he thinks about this information. He hasn't really told us that yet. The UN report goes on to name the 7 major drivers of these emerging animal to human diseases. First is the increasing demand. Okay, let's go a little faster. So he's got the increasing demand. He's using the word first to kind of organize different points. You may want to think about first, second, third to organize your paragraphs. As populations get richer, they eat more meat. Okay, so there's more, that goes along with more demand. All right, global meat production has more than quadrupled. You see how every sentence follows from the next. He talks about the increasing demand for animal protein, and then the sentences that follow are more about how people are eating more meat. Americans are the top meat consumers in the world, among the top meat consumers in the world. He has a fact here. Now, he's not using the MLA format because he's writing for the New York Times and they have a different format. So he's not using documentation. He's not telling us where his source, well, he told us about the United Nations, that's true. But I'm not actually sure if these facts here also come from that report. Probably they do. In this class, though, remember, you can't just tell us where it comes from in a signal phrase like this, where you say this author said blah, blah, blah. You also need, at the end, close to wherever, at the end, how should I say this? Whenever you get to the end of the information that you are using from that source, you want to use a little parentheses, 2 parentheses together, and in the middle of them, you put the first words that will help us scroll down to the bottom of your paper and in your works cited list, find that particular source. So if author is preferred, by the way, so if you have the author's name, then you would have their last name. And then we would know, we look for that last name and go all the way down to your works cited list, and we would see, that's the source that this information come from. If you don't have an author, you would take the title, but don't put the whole title in the parentheses. Just put an abbreviation, usually the first noun phrase or the first few words, just enough so that when we then go down to the works cited list at the end of your document, we can easily find it, right? He's not going to have a works cited because he's a writer for the New York Times. They don't do that necessarily. The way they cite things is they either just tell us in a signal phrase, they don't use the parentheses, or they have hyperlinks that you click on and it takes you to their source. Okay, so we would have to have some citations here, but he's not doing that. Okay, blah, blah, blah. In China, for instance, per capita meat consumption has more than doubled. So he went from the world to America to China, all to help us understand the fact that the demand for meat is going up. Okay, next paragraph. The more we eat, the more animals we need to raise. That topic statement follows from what he was just talking about. Oh, maybe that's not the topic statement, because then we have, that brings us to the second driver of pandemic risk. Okay, so we had a first driver. There were 7 major drivers. He used first to help us understand that was the first major driver. Now we have the second. driver of pandemic risk. What the impression I'm getting is that this information still comes from the UN. Okay, that the intensification of animal agriculture. So there's who raised their hold on, blah blah blah. Okay, so basically he's saying that technology is allowing us to grow bigger, fatter meat animals, and they're all crowded together, pumped full of antibiotics. So he's saying that's a risk that creates a risk of pandemic. The proximity of all these animals kind of forced together. These operators are a petri dish for viral mutation. Okay, so this is kind of a wrap-up paragraph of what came before. Yes, so these poor animals are overstressed. They fall over. They can develop diseases which then pass on to us. So what is he doing here? It sounds like he's building a case for why we need to replace most of our animal consumption with non-animal products. And he started off by saying, the first reward, remember the reward he was talking about? Where was that? Rewards, the rewards we could reap. The first reward is we can reduce the chance of worldwide diseases. So because he's a pretty advanced writer, you'll notice that his point is being spread out over multiple paragraphs. He didn't have one paragraph where he says, here's the first reward, and just talks about the reward in one paragraph. In the next paragraph, here's the second reward. He's taking multiple paragraphs to talk about these rewards. And that's just because he's written a lot. You could do the same thing. Our paper is maybe not as long, so there's maybe not as much room for you to spread out your ideas like that. But if you find that you have like a big fat paragraph and you're trying to keep it in one, but it's like 1 page long or nearly 1 page long, you may consider doing what he's doing, which is splitting up his idea. And then if you do that, the first line of those paragraphs should help us follow the flow. So he says, let me first lay out the urgency of the task and the rewards. Then he introduces a UN report that leads us into the first driver of these diseases, then the second driver. And actually this sentence here, the more we meet, the more animals we need to raise, that is like a transition that helps go from the paragraph earlier to this one, bringing us to the second driver of pandemic risk. Okay, and then he wraps things up here. Viruses are not the only health risk from industrial animal agriculture, though. Okay, so what's the other health risk? Antibiotics? Yeah, here they are. Here's a topic statement. The topic statement starts actually with a transitional sentence, taking us from viruses, which is what he was talking about earlier, to a different topic, which is the use of antibiotics. And I think he's talking about on the animals, right? He's talking about the animals. So something we can learn from this is transition statements. Look how useful it is to have this one sentence here that helps the reader sort of absorb and store away what we were just talking about so that they can then move on to the next point and not be confused. Okay, so antibiotics, he uses some statistics here. Of course, if you were writing this, you would need those parentheses with the name of your source or like the author name or the first few words of the title so that we can look down at your works cited and verify. Okay. So this is really disgusting. I feel like even though he's not being very, he's not using emotionally loaded language, he's still bringing up points here that I think work both on a logos level because he has nice facts. He seems like he's really done his homework. So that makes me, that makes me trust him a little bit. So that's ethos. I find him to be credible with this research that he's done. Logos, because he's using good facts to back up the claims that he's making, right? At least they seem good on a surface level, just on a first read here. Also, the point I was making earlier is though he's not using emotionally loaded language, the examples he's using are by their very nature going to cause an emotional reaction in most readers because he's talking about sick animals. He's talking about their antibiotics that they've been pumped full of being excreted onto the floor, which causes more. I mean, it's kind of gross. Even if you eat meat, I eat meat and I still think this is gross and I'm having an emotional reaction to it. So you want to think about the examples that you use and whether or not they can work on the emotions of your audience. And you don't have to be very manipulative or passionate in your writing to do that, but you can. Okay, to put that toll in perspective, what toll is he talking about? Antibiotic resistant diseases are already killing 700,000 people. So he's talking about that toll. There are around 3 million confirmed deaths of COVID-19 so far, right? So he's using current day pandemic to help drive this point. The health risks of animal agriculture are compounded, that means added to, by climate costs. Okay, so now we've just moved from just animal agriculture, antibiotic use in animal agriculture, and now we're moving to climate change. So we've got a fact about that. If you were writing this, you would need to cite this fact. This raises our disease risk. So I hope you see that, again, he's kind of breaking his paragraphs into pieces, but we can still follow because the first line always points back to what he said earlier. I caution you to be very careful when you start sentences with the word this. Many students go a little this crazy and they start putting this in front of a lot of their sentences. And this practice of doing that can be confusing because if I can't automatically know as soon as I get to the word this, what you are referring to, that's a problem. If I don't know, I have to look back as close to the word this. So I'd be looking around here. And in his case, it's very clear what he means. He's talking about this paragraph. But in some students, I look back and I'm like, I don't actually know what you're referring to. Or you might be referring to one of two things, and it's not clear to me. So be very careful with the word this. You might even want to add a word or a noun phrase after this that renames what you were talking about earlier, like, let's see, this increase in land given to animal agriculture increases our disease risk or something like that. Okay. We keep encroaching deeper into the wilderness. We're bringing ourselves, our domestic animals, yada, yada. We're cutting forests that were sequestering carbon and turning them over to cows. Okay. So this is all about using a lot of animal agriculture, which is having climate change effects. So these two paragraphs are actually related and could actually be put as one paragraph in your paper if you wanted to. I think he split them up so that we could really spend time thinking about these facts before moving on to his analysis of those facts, why they are important. Okay, about a quarter of global greenhouse emissions are traceable to the food supply chain. So hopefully he's going to keep talking about the food supply chain. If so, then this would be a good topic sentence. Let's see. Animal agriculture accounts for 3/4 of emissions, nearly 90% of those in the American diet. Yeah, so this is all about greenhouse gases and this food supply chain change. So he's still talking about climate change. Okay, so I think what I'm seeing here is that this paragraph, the health risk, this raises or decrease disease risk, and the about a quarter of global greenhouse gases, yada, yada. I think that's all about climate change. Many students would put that all in one paragraph, but I think it's a good idea that he split them up because if you put this all in one paragraph and you double spaced it, it would be more than a page long probably of writing. That's too much for a page. Okay. It's these next paragraphs where I fear I might lose you. Hey, look at that. He's talking to us. He's including us. I want you also to give me a sense that you are aware of your audience, that there's someone reading your work and you know that. And they can't ask you questions because you're not there, but you have to anticipate. What might they be asking? What might they be thinking? What are they worried about? Where's their mind going? What objections are they raising? That's what Ezra Klein, the author, is doing here. In these next paragraphs, it's these next paragraphs where I fear I might lose you. He's anticipated what people like me, meat eaters, might be thinking. It's easier to argue for human welfare than animal welfare. I spent most of my life not just as a meat eater, but as an enthusiastic one. I posted my burgers on Instagram, and I sought out the perfect roast chicken. Even now, I don't believe it's necessarily immoral to eat meat. Let me make sure I'm still actually recording. Yes, we are still recording. Are we? Yes, we are. Okay, good. I posted my burgers on Instagram and saw, okay, so he's talking about how he used to be a meat eater. Even now, he doesn't think it's immoral to eat meat. Hey, look at that. He's saying something that I think builds his ethos. It makes him sound more credible, reliable. It makes him sound like someone we should listen to, even if we're like, say, a committed meat eater, because he's saying, hey, it's not necessarily immoral to eat meat. I don't think that. I'm not angry at you. I'm not judging you. Then he goes on to say, what I believe is immoral is the way we treat animals in most factory farms. So he's making a distinction between the eating of meat and the treating of animals that are going to be, that are raised to be eaten. And the scale of that suffering melts the mind. Look how he ended his sentence and then started a new sentence with the word and. I don't recommend it unless you want to do it very intentionally. He made you think the sentence was over, but surprise, it's not over. And then the next sentence is short, snappy, dramatic due to its length. And due to the fact that it's a fragment, it's not a complete sentence. It got separated by that period. All right, so we're launching into the suffering I think that animals are going to are experiencing. 70 billion land animals are raised and slaughtered, so that's some evidence. Oh, look, Nick Kristof. Isn't that a guy we've read 2 articles from? It seems like these are 2 reporters that are friendly or are sharing information. Nick Kristof has written eloquently about the plight of Costco's rotisserie chickens, but the horrors do not end there. I've spoken with farmers who lie awake with guilt over the way they treat their animals, but they are so buried in debt to the agricultural conglomerates that they see no way out for themselves. Wow. I'm seeing not only some good logos, some good like evidence to back up his reasons, but I'm seeing pathos. This is really working on my heartstrings. Yeah, also ethos, because I get the sense he's done a lot of research. He's talked to actual farmers that have things to say about this. He knows and is referring to the work of Nick Kristof. So he knows people who have written about this. So this is chock full of persuasive appeals, pathos, logos, ethos. Yeah. We treat too many animals like inputs, and their suffering is a mere byproduct. Yes, cheap meat isn't really cheap. Okay, it's the animal that paid the cost. So he's saying our food is relatively cheap these days in America, but that's because the animal pays the cost of that food, which honestly, I've never heard that argument before. I mean, I know that animals are mistreated when they're raised, but I've never heard it put that way in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. I've also never heard about farmers who lie awake with guilt over the way that they're kind of forced to raise the food to make ends meet. So this is really effective, in my opinion. And then he says, but suffice it to say, if we could produce meat we want without the suffering we now inflict, it would be one of the greatest achievements of our age. So he took us from this low down, emotionally gross place where we're thinking about animal suffering and the people who have to cause the suffering, who themselves are not happy about doing it. And then he lifts us out of that at the end of the paragraph, strangely enough, by saying, if we could change this, that would be almost, remember the moonshot to what is it? Moonshot to meatless meat. Where was he? Yes, here we go. He's reminding us of that idea that making this change to mostly meatless meat would be great in the way that it is to go to the moon. One of the greatest achievements of our age. My reason for optimism is technological. Here's a topic statement. He's going to be changing the subject to talk about the technologies that we have and how they make him optimistic and probably should make us optimistic. There have been remarkable strides made in plant-based meat. Witness the success of Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods. That's a good example because people are increasingly having experiences eating these types of meat. I visited Canada a couple years ago and I tried my first Beyond Meat burger. It was pretty good. I was surprised. I then had a second Beyond Meat burger somewhere else. I don't know where it was. I didn't like it as much that time. I feel like I'd learned what it tasted like and it was kind of bothering me. But I knew enough. I had enough of an experience to know that it was close. It was getting there. I've heard the Impossible Foods taste even better. And milks. Okay, the next step is cultivated meat, which is the meat grown directly from animal cells. It's not science fiction. There's a restaurant in Singapore where you can eat lab-grown chicken made by Eat Just. Surprisingly, it tastes like chicken because that's what it is. So that's great. So we went from plant-based meat is one example of meatless meat. So these are meats made out of things like beans and like there's all these different kind of like vegetable products that they blend together and it ends up tasting a lot like meat. But you can also grow the meat from animal cells. So it is, in fact, animal cells. You actually are eating animal meat. It just didn't come from an animal, which should blow your mind. But so far, most of these advances, most of these investments are through private dollars. So here he said he was optimistic. Here he's saying, but, and that's a clue. The words that are at the beginning of your sentences help us know how we should feel about what's coming next. So he's letting us know there's a problem. But so far, most of these advances are made through private dollars. So he says we need to move faster than that. Here's a quote. Okay, he hasn't used a lot of quotes. I think you'll have noticed he didn't use any quotes at all. You can use more quotes. He's doing more paraphrasing, more summarizing of things that he's learned from other people. Look how he did it. He just says, we're going to need to move faster than that, period. And he starts a quote. This is advanced. I wouldn't recommend doing this unless you really have a sense of what you're doing. I would recommend that you tell us who is speaking before you add the quote. But he decided to leave us wondering until we get to the end of the quote. If we leave this endeavor to the tender mercies of the market, there will be vanishingly few products to choose from, and it'll take a very long time. Bruce Friedrich, co-founder and executive director of the Good Food Institute, told me. So this is a perfectly good quote. I think students are more accustomed to putting the Bruce Friedrich, blah, 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 all this before the quote. But if you feel comfortable and you know that it's going to make sense to us, go ahead and do it this way. If you're for our class, you'd still need to do the citation. So if this was your writing, right after the word me and before the period, you would have a space, parentheses, and inside you would have Friedrich. Even though you said, well, I'm going to make you do that anyway, because I really do want you to get used to using the parentheses. The reason I paused there for a second is I thought, well, you have the name here, so you wouldn't need to repeat it in the parentheses. I think that's technically the rule. I'm not going to be a stickler about this or remove points, but I just want you to not forget about those parentheticals because it's so common for students to do that. So just get in the habit of having parentheticals and put Friedrich. If you really think that you don't need to because you already said who the person was, then it might be okay. This is where policymakers can and should come in. At its heart, the American Jobs Plan is a climate bill, but there isn't a dollar for alternative proteins despite animal agriculture's huge contributions to both climate and pandemic risk. That's worse than a mistake. It's a failure of policy design. Luckily, it's easily fixed. So we went from his optimism, we have the technology, to next paragraph. The investments are all private, which is a problem. Next, our lawmakers can create an American Jobs Plan. Okay. Yes, the American Jobs Plan should have more money set aside for these alternative proteins. I keep asking alternative protein experts what they wish was in the bill. And he's talking about that bill, the American Jobs Plan. And the answers I get back are almost laughably small compared with the sums Congress is otherwise considering. The Good Food Institute produced a wish list calling for $2 billion in funding. half of it for research and half of it set up for a network of innovation centers. I'd like to see Congress dream a bit bigger, but the point is that it wouldn't take much. So basically, the point here is he's saying, if you look at the American Jobs Plan, it's a huge amount of money. It's many, many, many billions, if not, well, I don't want to take us off track, but we could look it up. It might even be more than $1 trillion. I don't have that information in my head. But he's saying that when he talks to the experts, they're like, a couple billion, which is a lot of money, but not when you compare to a policy meant to help the entire country. Those are in the many multiple billions. So this now seems reasonable, even though it's a big number. Okay. He reminds us he's got good analysis, which is he doesn't just drop in. He doesn't just have a topic statement and give us some evidence. He also talks about it. So here he says, I'd like to see Congress dream bigger. It wouldn't take much to supercharge this industry. And then he talks about the rewards of doing that. Economic as well as ecological purpose. It would ensure American leadership in what it would ensure American leadership in what will be one of the defining agricultural products of the future, right? So he's saying it would make Americans the leaders in this next agricultural kind of futuristic innovation. I like his use of colons. I don't know if you've noticed, but he's been doing that a lot. Like, where was the other colon? Here. But suffice it to say, and then he uses a colon, and then he introduces the explanation that was promised by this sentence. And same thing over here. He says there will be an economic or ecological purpose. So we're thinking, okay, what is that purpose? And then he provides the explanation right after that. That's one of the reasons that people use colons like that. Now we have a quote. I do not recommend that you start a paragraph with a quote unless you really know what you're doing or run it by me, because when students do this, often the paragraph then doesn't make any sense or there's like no analysis. This is how journalists write, where they have paragraphs that are mainly someone talking without the author themselves telling us why this is important. I would prefer that you surround quotes with who said it and why it matters. But here, okay, we have a couple of quotes here, which I think really these quotes are just backing up what he said earlier. Yeah, these maybe if you were writing this paper, you would just include these inside this paragraph. Okay, funding alternative programs doesn't mean adopting a vegan diet or believing that all animal consumption is wrong. So now he's getting back to what he started with when he was saying, I'm a vegan, but I'm realistic. I don't think eating meat is immoral. That thread is continuing through his paper. And we can tell he's starting to wrap up his argument because we're starting to get repetition of what came before. And I think he's working a little bit on ethos and pathos here. On the one hand, he wants us, many of us are meat eaters, to stay with him and to believe in what he's saying. So that's ethos there. We see him as being a little more trustworthy than perhaps some other vegan that might come at you really aggressively or in a judgmental way. That's ethos, I think. But also pathos, he's giving us a feeling, he's giving us the permission almost to feel good about the fact that we could continue to eat meat in the future as long as we find a way to replace where the meat comes from, have it not come from animals as much. So there's a pathos effect there, in my opinion. One possible future. So this sounds like a conclusion, right? He's talking about the implications, what will come later if we listen to him or don't listen to him. So you want to think about implications when you end your argument. One possible future or a possible implication down the line is that alternative proteins take over the market for cheap meat, replacing the commodity meat that goes into so many burgers and chicken nuggets and fish sticks. So, and animal-based meat becomes a much smaller part of our diet. Right. So maybe like all, like McDonald's McNuggets, we've all heard that a lot of the meat that's in there is just like the cartilage and the stuff that's not normally the good cuts of meat. He's saying maybe all that stuff will be replaced by these alternative animal proteins that don't come from animals because they'll be so cheap that it makes more sense to use those. And in the end, if your McDonald's McNuggets taste basically the same, you don't really care where they come from. In fact, most people, I think, would prefer that they didn't actually come from cartilage and bits of bone and the kind of stuff that you don't really want to be eating. Okay. Nor should the growth of this industry be a threat to farmers or ranchers. So up here he was saying we don't have to become vegans, and animal consumption isn't necessarily wrong. Not all of it is wrong. And now he's continuing. Nor, so that means funding alternative proteins does not mean that this will be a threat to farmers or ranchers. So there are bills. Here's a bill from California to pay farmers to transition to plants. And we need skilled land stewardship. So he's saying farmers are still going to be looped in. Hopefully we can get them to transition over so they're not just completely cut out. And we need labor stewardship, people who know how to work the land, so they will still have jobs. If we can't make saving the planet pay as much as harming it did, then our economic philosophies have truly failed. So he's saying we've got to find a way to make this work from the economic and labor point of view. Otherwise, what's the point? His final sentence: we are living right now with the true costs of cheap meat. A world of pandemics. Now he's going back to the beginning, right? World of pandemics, climate and emergency, and the suffering for both human beings and the creatures we consume. Look at that. A final sentence that not only works as a powerful emotional kind of a punch, but it also covers the points that he was talking about earlier. This wasn't his thesis, remember, because this thesis doesn't tell us what we should do. It's telling us what we could. I mean, this line right here, it's not telling us what we should do. It's not his claim. This is the significance of the claim, the rewards that we could get if we follow his claim. His actual thesis was earlier. It was, what we need is for the government to put money and muscles behind the project, blah, 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 so that the future happens fast enough to save the planet. That's what this whole essay was actually arguing. At the end, he just reminds us of what is in our reach, what we could gain if we listen to his argument. So we had great organization, a good introduction. He's aware of his audience. He knows his audience isn't all vegans. He's talking to a mixed general audience, especially to people who don't necessarily agree with him. One thing I noticed is that he doesn't really have a specific section where he considers opposing views. He doesn't go like, opponents say blah, blah, blah. But what he did is he mixed it throughout. He was aware of what the objections might be, like, what about the economy? What about losing jobs? And he just addresses that. Yeah, like it wouldn't be a threat to farmers or ranchers. He actually used his conclusion to talk about some of the objections, but he didn't use keywords like objection or opponents. You can if you want. He just doesn't do that because he has a bit of a deft way of weaving the objections throughout. I would still prefer if you very clearly have parts where you actually straight up say something like, opponents say this, or detractors might bring up this, or sometimes people say that this might be a problem and they're correct for these reasons, but blah, blah, blah. Like, please try to directly address the opposing views. It makes it easier for me to grade, honestly, because I can find it. It also just makes it easier for you to write your paper. If you want to do it in a way like this, where you kind of weave it through, sort of imply the opposition, you can do that. Maybe run it by me, or we can have a meeting and we can talk about how to do that. He takes care of a lot of the opposition by imagining meat eaters and what they might think, and taking care to not scare them away from his paper, and taking care to provide evidence that their fears will not come to light, I think. I think also the way that he has handled opposition is he's saying that the stakes are so important and there's so much, there's so many bad implications if we keep eating animals at the rate that we are, that there's almost no opposition that can be made against that. He seems to be pretty passionate against this, but his way of discussing it doesn't seem passionate because of how calm his language is, how unjudgmental it is. it's not something you would expect from someone who would write a nationally read article and who is a vegan and is arguing for a vegan position. You might expect him to be more aggressive. You might expect him to be more, even just more passionate, more like personally invested through his choice of words. But he's not doing that. He's treating us like people who could agree with him if we just heard a reasonable case, and he's treating us like people who are not do not merit being judged. Just merit. What we merit is just to see that there's a reasonable case to move in a direction that we would be happy with and would reduce suffering. Okay. I'm going to take a pause here and then record an analysis of 2 student sample arguments.